We turn now to West Virginia, where a former pharmacist accused of killing her husband with insulin.
Natalie Cochran, a Raleigh County woman convicted of murdering her husband.
Natalie Cochran was found guilty of using insulin to poison and kill her husband, Michael Cochran, last month.
Fine-tooth comb. The folks answered our questions honorably and fairly, and the court finds that we had a completely fair jury.
On the morning of February 6, 2019, 38-year-old Michael Cochran believed he was finally about to uncover the truth behind a business that had consumed his family's life for years. A trip had been arranged, answers were supposedly waiting, and Michael was ready to see them for himself. But the trip was suddenly canceled. Only hours later, Michael collapsed inside his own home. What happened next is what still troubles investigators. Multiple people saw him unconscious. Friends arrived. A medically trained friend urged that he get immediate help. Yet valuable time passed before Michael was finally taken to the hospital. 5 days later, he was dead. At first, it appeared to be a tragic medical emergency. But years later, investigators reopened the case, and the question changed completely. What really happened inside that house? Why didn't anyone call 911? And was Michael already being silenced before he ever had the chance to learn the truth? To understand that day, we first need to understand the life Michael thought he was living. Long before investigators questioned how Michael Cochran died, the people who knew him remembered how he lived. Born and raised in West Virginia, Michael built his life around hard work, family, and the belief that a person's character was measured by how they treated others. He wasn't known for seeking attention or chasing wealth. Instead, friends described him as dependable, humble, and someone who could always be counted on when help was needed. At home, Michael was a devoted husband and a proud father who rarely missed an opportunity to support his children. Whether he was attending school events or coaching local youth sports, he enjoyed being present in the moments that mattered most. Parents respected him, young athletes admired him, and neighbors saw him as the kind of person every community hopes to have. His marriage appeared equally strong. To those on the outside, Michael and Natalie had built a successful life together, sharing the same goals and celebrating the same achievements. There was little reason for anyone to believe their family was anything other than happy and secure. Looking back, that image feels almost impossible to reconcile with what would eventually happen. Because if everything about Michael's life seemed so ordinary, so stable and so full of promise, how could it all end in one of West Virginia's most shocking murder cases? Sometimes, the people we trust the most are the ones we question the least. In 2017, Michael and his wife, Natalie, believed they were building something that could change their future forever. Together, they became involved in a business that claimed to secure lucrative government contracts, offering investors the chance to participate in projects that promised remarkable financial returns. To friends, relatives, and members of their community, it appeared to be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. As confidence in the company grew, so did the image of success surrounding the Cochran family. Their lifestyle seemed to improve almost overnight. They purchased expensive vehicles, traveled frequently, and spoke confidently about the business's bright future. People who had known Michael for years trusted his judgment, believing he would never support something he didn't genuinely believe in. That trust encouraged more investors to join, convinced they were backing a legitimate and thriving enterprise. Yet beneath the appearance of prosperity, small inconsistencies were beginning to emerge. Questions about the contracts were often answered with reassurance instead of documentation. Every concern seemed to have a reasonable explanation, and Michael accepted those explanations because he trusted the people closest to him. But trust can sometimes hide the truth instead of revealing it. Everything looked successful from the outside, so why did no one seem able to produce the proof everyone expected to see? Soon, the quiet doubts that most people ignored would become impossible to dismiss. For a while, every concern about the business was met with another reassuring explanation. But by early 2019, those explanations were no longer enough. Investors who had trusted the company with their savings were growing impatient. Expected payments failed to arrive, promised updates became increasingly vague, and more people began asking the same uncomfortable question. Where was the money? Michael wasn't looking for someone to blame. Like everyone else, he simply wanted answers. As he reviewed the situation more closely, he began noticing small inconsistencies that he had previously overlooked. Conversations no longer matched earlier promises, and each explanation seemed to raise even more questions. For the first time, Michael appeared determined to see the evidence for himself. To put his concerns to rest, Natalie arranged what sounded like the perfect solution. A meeting with bank representatives in Virginia would supposedly confirm that the business funds were real. A private flight was scheduled, and Michael believed the trip would finally clear away every doubt. But that meeting would never happen. On the very morning they were supposed to leave, the flight was unexpectedly canceled. What seemed like an inconvenience at the time would later become one of the most closely examined moments in the entire investigation. Because within hours of that canceled trip, Michael's life would change forever. Investigators would eventually ask a chilling question. Was someone making sure Michael never discovered the truth? The morning that was supposed to bring answers ended before it truly began. The flight Michael believed would finally prove everything was suddenly canceled, leaving him confused but hopeful that the meeting could simply be rescheduled. Instead, only a short time later, he suddenly collapsed inside his home. At first, those around him may not have understood exactly what was happening. But as the hours passed, one person after another witnessed the same alarming scene. A friend arrived and found Michael unconscious. Soon, another friend entered the house and saw that he still hadn't responded. Then a close family friend with medical training examined him and immediately recognized that his condition required urgent medical attention. She warned that he needed to get to a hospital without delay. Yet Michael remained where he was. With every passing minute, the questions became more disturbing. Why was everyone waiting? Why did no one immediately call 911? Why did those present accept that he simply needed more time to recover? As valuable minutes turned into hours, the opportunity to intervene grew smaller. The clock became Michael's greatest enemy, and every decision or lack of one would later come under intense scrutiny. By the time someone finally decided to take Michael to the hospital, doctors were no longer treating an ordinary medical emergency. They were fighting against hours that could never be recovered. By the time Michael finally arrived at the hospital, doctors immediately realized they were dealing with a critical medical emergency. Tests revealed that his blood glucose level had dropped to an alarmingly low level, something physicians would later describe as highly unusual for a healthy man with no history of diabetes. His brain had already been deprived of the glucose it needed to function, causing severe swelling and irreversible damage. Medical teams worked desperately to stabilize him, but despite their efforts, Michael never regained consciousness. Over the following days, his condition continued to deteriorate as specialists searched for an explanation that could account for such a sudden and devastating collapse. None of the answers seemed to fit. On February 11, 2019, surrounded by those closest to him, Michael Cochran passed away at just 38 years old. For his family, it was a heartbreaking loss that appeared to be the result of a tragic and unexplained medical event. But as medical experts later reviewed the timeline, many agreed on one painful reality. Earlier emergency treatment could have significantly improved Michael's chances of survival. Every hour that passed without immediate care allowed the damage to grow worse. That conclusion left investigators and the public with one haunting question. Was Michael's death unavoidable, or did the delay in getting help turn a survivable emergency into a fatal tragedy? While Michael's family struggled to cope with their loss, another investigation was quietly uncovering secrets that would change the entire case forever. While Michael's family struggled to come to terms with his sudden death, federal investigators were uncovering a completely different mystery. Their investigation wasn't focused on a suspicious death. It was focused on money. Complaints from investors had triggered an inquiry into the business Michael and Natalie had promoted, with many claiming they had invested their savings in what they believed were profitable government contracts. As investigators reviewed financial records, emails, and business documents, the picture became increasingly troubling. Promised contracts could not be verified, supporting documents appeared questionable, and millions of dollars entrusted by investors could not be properly accounted for. More victims came forward, each describing the same promises of extraordinary returns backed by what they believed were legitimate opportunities. The deeper investigators dug, the more the carefully crafted image of success began to unravel. What once appeared to be a thriving business was now being examined as a complex web of financial deception. Then the investigation took an unexpected turn. Evidence collected during the fraud case caused investigators to re-examine Michael's death through an entirely different lens. Questions that had once belonged to doctors were now being asked by detectives. Suddenly, this wasn't just about missing money. It was about whether financial deception had hidden something far more sinister. Investigators weren't searching for a homicide, they simply followed the evidence. And the evidence led them back to Michael. As investigators reconstructed Michael's final days, the case began to shift from suspicion to evidence. Every witness statement, medical report, and forensic finding became another piece of a puzzle that had remained incomplete for years. Detectives carefully compared timelines, looking for inconsistencies between what people claimed had happened and what the evidence suggested. One discovery stood out above all the others. Medical testing and expert analysis pointed investigators toward insulin, a substance Michael had no legitimate reason to receive, as he was not diabetic. Specialists explained that his critically low blood sugar was consistent with insulin exposure rather than a naturally occurring medical condition. That conclusion raised an obvious question. If Michael couldn't have done this to himself, who could have? Investigators also noticed that some witness accounts changed over time. Small contradictions about Michael's condition, the timeline of events, and the decisions made inside the house became increasingly difficult to ignore. Combined with digital records, forensic evidence, and findings from the FBI investigation, prosecutors believed they had assembled a compelling explanation of what had happened. For the first time, the evidence appeared to tell one clear story. But building a convincing case for investigators was only half the battle. Now the real question wasn't what happened to Michael. It was whether a jury would find the evidence strong enough to prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt. Nearly 6 years after Michael Cochran's death, the investigation reached its final and most important stage, the courtroom. Prosecutors argued that Michael's death was not the result of a mysterious medical emergency, but the final act in a much larger scheme driven by deception and financial gain. They presented medical experts, forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the reconstructed timeline of Michael's final hours, arguing that the evidence pointed to a deliberate act rather than a natural tragedy. The defense challenged those conclusions, insisting that the prosecution's case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence. They questioned the medical findings, disputed the state's interpretation of the timeline, and argued that reasonable doubt still existed. For days, both sides presented competing versions of the same events, leaving the jury to determine which story was supported by the evidence. After carefully considering the testimony, the jury reached its decision. Natalie Cochran was found guilty of first-degree murder. The trial then entered the mercy phase, where jurors considered whether she should ever be eligible for parole. After hearing emotional arguments from both sides, they denied mercy, sentencing her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Michael's family, the verdict delivered justice, but it could never erase the loss they had endured. Even after the courtroom fell silent, one difficult question remained. Was Michael's death caused by one calculated decision, or by a series of choices that allowed tragedy to unfold before anyone chose to act? This case wasn't remembered simply because a man was murdered. It endured because it exposed how easily trust can be exploited and how hesitation can carry irreversible consequences. Michael trusted the person closest to him. Others trusted the explanations they were given. And as everyone assumed someone else would take responsibility, precious time slipped away. The verdict answered who was legally responsible, but it couldn't answer the question that continues to haunt this case. If you had been there, would you have recognized the danger? Or would you have trusted the wrong person too? Perhaps that's why this story doesn't just make us question one killer. It makes us question humanity itself.